Hello and welcome to the Conscious Capitalists, hosted by two of the co-founders of the Conscious Capitalism movement and co-authors of the Conscious Capitalism Field Guide from Harvard Business Press, Raj Sisodia and Timothy Henry. Each week, this podcast covers current events and business news and Raj and Timothy's latest thinking on what it takes to build a conscious business. For more information and notes from the show, go to www.theconsciouscapitalists.com. And now, Raj and Timothy.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode number 35 of The Conscious Capitalists with myself, Timothy Henry, and my partner in making the world a better place through business, Raj Sisodia. Hi, Raj.
Hi, Timothy. Great to be with you again.
Good to be with you again. And it is really an honor today to have Coen Gilbert with us, one of the founders of B Lab, the current co-chair of Imperative 21. We'll get into a little bit about what that is. Jay's really got an assorted background. When he came out of college, he was a McKinsey consultant for a little bit, but we'll forgive him for that. He then went in and did some work in New York and then started a basketball apparel and shoe company, which was then quite successful. And then he sold off. And in his second act in life, he got involved with starting B Labs. And B Labs has been a partner with Conscious Capitalism from the very beginning. With your partner, Andrew, and you, Jay, you've been right beside us all along the way, and love Absolutely. To think of you as sort of a sister and brother organization to one another as we're all sort of pulling in the same direction here. Welcome.
100%. Thank you so much, Timothy. Good to be with you. Good to be with you, Raj.
So maybe begin a little bit with the story of how you came on that journey to B Labs and what motivated you and how did that come to be something that you were really keen on getting started?
Sure. Happy to tell a little short story about that. And like one version of that story that we can start with is it all started with a bottle of salad dressing. And a little logo on the rim of the salad dressing bottle that was a heart with a dollar sign money through it, like a heart money. We called it the heart money logo that some of your listeners may recall from a lot of Newman's Own products back in the day. I don't think the logo's on there anymore, but Newman's Own is obviously still quite a robust brand. And for a variety of reasons, I was inspired by the power of business to be a force for good. And at the time, at the company And One, Timothy referred to, we were looking for ways to sort of bring what we called our And One service mission, to life. And our limited aperture of our lens said, oh, well, that's through charitable giving, a natural door through which people enter this space. And we had always given 5% of our profits to charity at And One. And I was starting to read some of the early literature. This is way back in the 90s. And there were companies like Patagonia and Tom's of Maine and Ben & Jerry's and Stonyfield Farm that were all doing 10% because 10% was the maximum allowable, the tax deductible in the US IRS code. I was like, oh, well, 10% is twice as good. We should do 10%. And then I realized I've been eating this salad dressing forever and loved it. It was basically an excuse the salads were an excuse to drink the salad dressing, basically. It's like, well, that's 100% to charity. That's even 10 times better than all these other leading companies. And so the original B Corp idea was about a brand for businesses that we called at the time Newman Ventures. That were going to be a whole class of companies that gave all of their profits to charity. And I had found 24 companies around the world that were the Newman of travel agency or the Newman of bottled water or the Newman of, whatever it might have been, office supplies, Newman of a winery. And they all had agreed to come together with an overarching ingredient brand to be this force for good. And sort of this pure play. And as we started to talk to others about that, we're going to raise a fund to fund these companies as an evergreen engine of charitable giving. we started to come across organizations like Social Venture Network and Investor Circle and Business Alliance for Local Living Economies and all these different groups and academics and other thought leaders in the space. And they helped me see over a couple year period just how myopic the vision was for just thinking about business for good as business for charity.
Yeah.
And that there were so many other things that businesses do that create positive value in the world. Charitable giving is one of them. It's a perfectly wonderful thing to do and should be applauded and encouraged and done better. But it's actually not only not the only thing, but probably not the most important thing that a business can do. And so gradually the aperture on mine and then eventually our lens widened to recognize that your purpose, your practices, your policies, how you measured your performance and all of that was important. And one of those ways one of your policies or one of your practices could be your charitable giving. And so the journey to B Corp was through a lot of salad dressing and Newman's Own popcorn and lemonade and the evolution of talking with hundreds of other business leaders in the space who helped us see more clearly what we were blind to before, which was all our decisions about our workforce and our community engagement, our supply chain and all those other things were far more important than what we did with whatever ended up at the end of the year. And out of that came the idea of a B Corp that could encapsulate all of that, including but not limited to the charitable giving.
I just wanted to add, Jay, that it's interesting the history of conscious capitalism as a phrase also goes back to Muhammad Yunus and the Grameen Bank in Bangladesh, right? So he described what he was doing as conscious capitalism, which today I think we would call it a social business.
That's right.
Whose only and essentially primary purpose is a social impact, right? So they reinvest the profits back into that impact, or they could be donating them to charity, some version of that. And I think we have said, no, having financial returns is also important. Free societies don't function without the wealth generated by businesses. I mean, how do we pay for infrastructure and how do we pay for all the other things that we want, right? So society being a stakeholder, but also investors, and that allows you to scale and achieve impact in a much bigger way. So I think that idea is great. And I think we're all do-gooders. We want to do good in the world, but recognizing that a business that generates profits and has investors has the potential to do even more good.
That's absolutely right.
A business that constrains itself in that specific way. So,
yeah, one of the earliest lessons: no margin, no mission.
Right, right. So as you started off, I mean, obviously you said, "Hey, that's an interesting label. Let's start to try to see if we can identify these companies." And I think that then led to you sort of saying, "How could we codify it? How could we actually, quote unquote, have a certification of sorts?" And tell us about how that first sort of tranche of this is what we should look for as sort of the thing that distinguishes a good company.
Right. And so we've never had an original idea. And so our best strategy has been to look for where the innovation is already happening and look for pattern recognition and connections. And then sometimes there may be gaps. And what we saw was that there was actually, and again, this is the mid 2000s. There was a lot of energy. There was fair trade. There was green building. There was, early 1% for the planet. There was environment. Like there was lots of different pockets of activity. There was microfinance. They didn't call it impact investing back then. There was lots of other things going on, but they were all pretty stovepiped. And nobody was seeing it as a coherent whole. A guy named David Bornstein had just written a book that started to look at social entrepreneurship as a field, but not necessarily looking at that in the for-profit world. It was mostly looked at in the nonprofit world. And we were seeing all this for-profit innovation taking place, organic and all the rest of it, but none of it really seeing itself as part of one coherent movement. And so the first was recognizing there was something really powerful going on already, right? It didn't start with B Corp. B Corp was recognizing things that were already happening. But what it lacked was a coherent overarching narrative, for one thing, to break through the clutter. And it also lacked any real coherent set of standards that were company-wide, not just product specific.
Yeah.
Or practice specific. And so they were more holistic and integrated. And so recognizing that there might be utility to an overarching narrative that could unify, provide the sort of an ingredient brand that could unify that field, make it more visible, powerful to consumers, to workers, to investors, policymakers, et cetera. And then also that, like in any Wild West frontier, there's a lot of activity, but also a lot of confusion, a lot of dust being kicked up in the air. And so there was also a lot of confusion about what is a responsible business, what is a green business, what is a sustainable business. Those are the words that were being used at that time. Impact wasn't really in the vernacular, let alone regenerative or other things that are more common now. And so you had some membership organizations, but mostly the membership was, do you know so-and-so? And could you pay the registration fee? But that's not super useful to consumers, right? Or to investors to distinguish good companies from good marketing. And so the idea of looking at this in an integrative way, looking at this in a way that had a common narrative and brand that could project some power into the marketplace, and that the only power of that brand was based upon whether the companies met rigorous set of standards, always imperfect, but at least a rigorous set of transparent standards that where people, all those different stakeholders could say, yeah, you know what, like that's what I'm talking about. That's worth my trust. And ultimately, that's the most powerful thing a business or a brand can have, is it can have trust from its various stakeholders. And this is a way to signal that that this company is worthy of your trust. And so it came out of that recognition, and then building that set of standards on the shoulders of a bunch of things that existed in individual silos, but sort of weaving them together into something that was more company driven and not just product driven.
Well, you know, Jay, it's amazing what you have accomplished through that movement. I mean, I hear about it all over the world, and there are countries where they're coming up with their own version of that, like in Colombia. And I do remember that when John and I wrote Conscious Capitalism, I guess we weren't fully informed or understood it deeply enough, because we ended up writing about all these other things that are happening in the world and how conscious capitalism is different and so forth. And our comment at the time was, B Corps are great, but you don't have to be a B Corp. You can be a conscious business without being a B Corp. And it's kind of an optional thing. And I think, as you remember, you and John were on stage, and basically our position, I think his thinking and mine and many others, is that now we strongly recommend that, I mean, it's not a requirement to be in conscious capitalism, but we strongly recommend that all companies that aspire to or subscribe to these values become B Corps. And we recognize all B Corps as conscious businesses, even if they don't self-identify that way. So I think that's a big move. And I think we wrote that in the field guide, and you also wrote a whole section for us.
Absolutely. Like your point is right. Like every B Corp is a conscious capitalist, whether they self-identify that way or not. And the B Corp model, whether they get certified or not, is a useful toolkit, a useful roadmap for any conscious capitalist, right? To take their consciousness and put it into practice. Put those 4 tenets into practice, particularly around stakeholder orientation. And how do you measure and manage your business to deliver real value to all stakeholders? In addition to the 4,000 or so certified B corporations around the world, there's over 120,000 businesses that use the B Impact Assessment as a free roadmap and a toolkit to help them practice conscious capitalism. And B Lab's mission is not that everybody becomes a B Corp. B Lab's mission is that everybody becomes a conscious capitalist and then practices that consciousness. It actually manifests in their work in meaningful ways that improve year over year in delivering measurable, meaningful value to all of their stakeholders. Like that's ultimately what we're about. And the B Corp is a tool and a method of that and a community of practice for that. But it's not the only path, and it's not the destination by any stretch.
But I love that it brings in accountability. It brings in precision and measurement. So you can track your improvements over time. You can look at what others are doing, learn from them. So it's just a great initiative that you've been part of. I was speaking earlier today with Andy Burr, I'm on the board of advisors of eCountable.
Mm,
And if you look at one of the missing pieces in a way, or remaining pieces here, is with customers or consumers. Uh, they can see the B logo on certain products, but they don't know enough about it, right? And eCountable is a company that asks you what your values and priorities are, and then looks at your purchases and tells you how well you're doing on those.
right.
Right? You believe in climate change and social equity, whatever there's a long list. And they have data on, I think, about 5,000 companies at this point. No, more like 8,000. And I believe that now all the BCorps are going to be added to that
Fantastic.
to that list, right? I think there's some conversations going on.
Yep.
So what that does, I think, is allows us to push this towards customers as well, right? It's a push model, not just a pull model, so that people are now, because what it does, once it looks at your shopping, list from whatever you bought via the credit card data from multiple credit cards, it then gives you a score on everything that you bought, and then it nudges you towards choices that would be better aligned
Right.
with your
Right.
value system, which is
Right.
great, right? It's simple
Right.
and
Right.
an elegant solution to that, so that over time you start to then become aware of brands and companies and what they're doing. And so I just think that's a great natural connection there.
For sure. Like nudge for social change.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
There's-
Yeah, and it's fascinating because there's another company that I know of, that one of my friends on the board of, called Kogo, out of Australia, New Zealand, doing the same kind of thing, trying to
Yeah.
help consumers. So there's this whole sort of app ecosystem starting to evolve. And I'm curious, as you sort of think of B Corp and that certification process, how are you getting that message out to consumers? Or what's that next stage to get consumers to start saying, God, I recognize that brand? Because you've done a really good job of, like you say, 4,000 businesses have been certified. You've got over 100,000 that have actually taken the program and tried to rate themselves on it.
Yep.
What's that next step for getting that the brand of B Corp itself out there?
Yeah, it's a good question. So one of the things that B Lab is doing among the global partners is, in this next phase, is it feels like there's some critical mass of companies across every industry in 70 or 80 countries, et cetera. More and more large companies coming in that have real consumer presence, is that it's time for some more public-facing narrative, storytelling, brand building for the B. And so up until now, we've done things that are pretty much like laissez-faire, hands-off. Here's the tools, and the companies decide for themselves where in their communications hierarchy and priorities they put that stuff. And what's interesting is the folks that are coming on board now, like the big coffee company in Italy, Ely, just became a certified B Corp, and you're starting to see it from their homepage to all their retail stores. You'll start to see it on their cups eventually. Because it has enough meaning, and there are enough customers seeking to align their purchase with their values that they see value in it and want to incorporate it. The same for Danone, across the 30 some odd subsidiaries and consumer product brands that they've got, are putting it across all of that. And what's now possible is there to be some form of collective action, right? Where there's a think of it as a brand campaign for the overarching brand that we've never done before. And I think that's what we're going to look to see over the next 3 years as one form of collective action from the B Corp community. Ultimately, interestingly, not where most of the energy is. Like, it's happening because it's valuable and useful and creates a positive flywheel. But the energy on collective action is actually manifesting in other areas more directly tied to impact than to recognition, which we'd be happy to chat about if you're all interested. But I find that even more inspiring.
Well, go down that. Tell us a little bit more about what that means to you, this idea of recognition and impact, or impact. Where it's probably a big "and" there, but let's, but let's explore that. What did you mean by that?
And so, like, when I think about what are some of the most important things or the most inspiring things I've seen from the B Corp community over the last few years, it's been this notion of collective action. What can we do together that we can't do alone? And how do we really raise the bar on what's possible? for business leadership. And so the two examples I give, one is on the environmental side around climate, and the other is on the social side around inequality. And on the inequality front, if you remember, a couple of years back, there were millions of people in the streets of all over Chile, Santiago, Valparaiso, et cetera, protesting inequality, et cetera. And a group of B Corps got together in Chile and said, "How do we?" There's stuff on fire in the streets, right? It was a complete meltdown. That same year, there were people. The Yellow Jackets were in Paris, and there's global uprising around this, and it's showing up in different manifestations. They said, as business leaders, we have a responsibility here, and they said they issued a challenge called Desafío 10X or DSX, and it was, we're going to challenge companies to join us to have a pay ratio between the highest and the lowest employee of 10X. And whether or not people think that's a good ratio or it should be a different ratio, whatever, that's what they picked.
Right.
And they picked that.
In either case, it's better than 275 to 1, which it is in the US sometimes.
Totally. So they said, like, in our marketplace, that feels like where we would want to be in a society that was more equitable. And they're only like where there were a couple hundred B Corps in Chile at the time. And within a couple months, there were nearly 2,000 businesses that had joined the challenge in Chile alone. And to me, that's really powerful. At a moment when a whole society was in crisis and the Constitution is being rewritten, people are like, it's that you have a group of business leaders that had enough trust and relationship with each other to see each other, to be in community enough to say, what could we do? And what could we do together? And it's not only about us, but we want to invite other people. It wasn't like B Corps for 10X. It was much broader than that, but it created a platform for organizing that could send a message to say, we have a role in society that goes beyond our own four walls. That was one that I found incredibly inspiring. And so the 10X, if you will, was like 10X the number of B Corps that they got involved, right? Not just the pay ratio. And it's still going on. And another one that happened concurrently was around climate. And if you remember, the linkage between these two is the protests were going on in Chile and for the first time ever, forced the movement of the COP. I forget which one it was, 25 or 21, whatever, the COP gathering, which was scheduled for Santiago. And with only 3 months to like lift off, they had to cancel it and move it to Madrid. Unprecedented shift in the middle of accelerated climate energy and all the talk about climate emergencies and the Bank of England declaring climate emergencies, like lots of energy going on. And you had inequality in the global South shutting down the world's foremost gathering of the parties of governmental agencies, government entities talking about climate. They had to move that to Madrid. And in that span of time, the B Corp community rallied, and there were over 700 B Corps that ended up on stage in Madrid, declaring their commitment to a just transition to net zero by 2030, a full 20 years ahead of the Paris Agreement.
Right.
And so those two moments, the let's get to zero commitments from the B Corp community and using science-based targets and all the rest of it and the just transition to show that this was it's a false argument to say that this kind of stuff will kill small business. That's a job killer. It's a false argument to say you got to wait till 2050. Like there's some urgency to this, and we can show that it's possible. To be able to do that, and to see this clear interrelationship or linkage between what we often think of as siloed social impact or environmental impact, and seeing the relationship between the two, and seeing a community of business leaders. In the case of the net zero, they were from 30 or 40 countries around the world, to see them taking that kind of action and being recognized on stage for their leadership and helping to sort of debunk the myth that this isn't possible for small business and medium-sized business to do. Those two things are really powerful to me. And so I love the fact that B Corps are thinking about what they can do for collective marketing and to build the B brand and to make it easier for consumers to align their purchases with their values. And I am excited about that as a consumer. Makes it easy for me to shop for birthday presents and holiday gifts and all the rest of it. But I'm much more inspired and gratified every day when I see those companies leading, not just in things that will benefit them, a better brand to attract customers and talent, but a better world that they want to live in for their kids and their grandkids. Like that to me is really where the power is.
Well, it's interesting that that you bring up this idea of impact. And, at a time, I joked that a year ago when I started talking to some boards around about ESG and what it meant, it was like I met with blank stares, and now a year later, it's the flavor of the month in a big way. And I'm curious how you relate the following three things together. On the one hand, you've got ESG starting to set some standards that, that within the next year or so, we're going to be pretty clear that with the SSG, the sustainable reporting groups that are coming together, there will be a standard that will emerge over the next 12 to 18 months. And we then have the B Corp, which is focused on an individual business and in a sense, talking about how it operates. And then you've got sort of management accounting, and I spent a lot of time with the balanced scorecard when it was first being developed by Norton and Kaplan. I helped develop it. So, this idea of executing your strategy and having a set of managerial metrics that you can use, not all of which are financial. So there's a lot of non-financial metrics in there. We now have the B Corp certification as an importantly, the various dimensions and metrics that, I have a client that, is proudly a B Corp, the body shop, and, they're aware that there are these metrics that are, part of their triple bottom line commitment with Natura and all of that. And now you have ESG. And so you've got these sort of three dimensions. How do I navigate and manage my business? How do I set certain standards for ourselves in terms of how good a business we are? And then we've got this sort of from the outside in ESG kind of thinking. How do you relate those three?
Yeah. So Timothy, I appreciate the question around the linkage or the relationship between ESG, things like B Corp and individual company standards and sort of accounting standards. And I see them as different manifestations of the same desire, which is we want to be able to track the performance of companies and hold them accountable. And the B Corp standards are one measurement tool for environmental, social, and governance practices, right? There are many measurement tools. It's one.
Yeah.
And it's used by 120,000 businesses, mostly smaller businesses, but increasingly larger, publicly traded multinational companies. And so I don't see them as different. Where I think what's interesting is I think you're right that we will have credible common standards that will be, whether it's through the EU or the SEC or other sort of quasi-governmental bodies that are going to help set the standards and create a more efficient marketplace for that. Like that's going to happen. What is going to happen over time is the definition of what is material is going to change. And so I think the direction of travel for that is going to be from sort of, I'll call it single materiality, with the single being financially material to investors. Yeah. Which is where ESG has come from, and largely where folks like the Sustainability Standards Board proposal in front of the, IFRS and other things are moving, and where the SEC is, like they're going to start there because it makes sense because they're largely coming out of that capital market space. Yeah. So their core constituency is the investor, and the investor's core concern today is what's financially material to my returns. Yeah. And where I think the trajectory of that is going to go over time is we're going to move from single materiality to double materiality is how some people frame it. The double materiality is what's financial material to investors and what is material to society. Because just because it's material to investors isn't the begin all end all. Like it's good to know. That's like really useful information, but they're not the only stakeholder in society. They're an important one, but they're not the only one. And so the B Corp standards and groups like the Impact Management Project and others have been developing and in an emerging marketplace of standards and thinking. But what does it mean to develop standards around what's material to all of those stakeholders? What's material to workers? What's material to communities? What's material to the next generation in terms of the environment that we hand over? They may be also material to investors over different timeframes, and they may not, but those are two very different standards by which you would judge the standard. Is material to whom? And so I think that in the long run, and I hope it's not as long as I fear, but in the long run, those ESG standards will evolve in their definition of materiality from being solely financially focused and exclusive of, to being financially focused and include those other things. And eventually it will be, no, we must include those other things. And the first path to that, Timothy, is going to be around assessments of systemic risk.
Yep.
Because, and climate is an obvious example and easily like quantified.
Yep.
The pandemic has certainly highlighted systemic risks. And I'd argue inequality and the racial reckoning that we're going under, not just in the US, but in many countries around the world. There are systemic risks to a fraying social fabric, right? And to threats to democracy here and abroad, in the US and abroad, in many places. Those are systemic threats. And if you're a long-term asset owner, your returns are actually about market return. 80-90% of your return are about market returns, not about your individual portfolio management or the wisdom of your asset manager. And so if the market is heading for trouble, then you're heading for trouble. And so you've got to manage systemic risk. And all of a sudden, those ESG factors, those societally relevant metrics are now all of a sudden relevant, maybe not to this individual enterprise or that individual enterprise, but maybe not even in my fund versus your fund.
Yeah.
But if I'm a universal owner, if I'm BlackRock or a sovereign wealth fund or a pension fund or an insurance company, I own the market. I can't like beat the market because I am the market. And so if I am the market, then I need the market to be healthy. If I need the market to be healthy, I need to manage systemic risk. If I need to manage systemic risk, it means I need to look at things like climate and inequality and democratic institutions.
Yeah.
And I have to care about those things because they will jeopardize my overarching returns, which are for beneficiaries. I've got to hold that for decades, if not a generation out, for retirees.
So how does that connect to the B Corp standard and certification that you've been driving now for a while, which is about how the company operates, where the ESG is sort of looking at outputs. You're looking at sort of the, how does this company operate? And
I'd say two ways, Timothy. I think one is obviously the B Corp standards, the B impact assessment is looking at double materiality, right? It's looking at materiality to stakeholders, not just materiality to shareholders. So that's the first. It's adopted that framework from the very beginning. The second thing, as you know, and we've had lots of fun conversations about this over the years, including the one that Raj mentioned earlier with John Mackey, is in order to be a certified B Corp, there's also a legal standard. Right? There's also a legal piece, which is the adoption of stakeholder governance. Not just everything we've been talking about here is stakeholder management. But that management still takes place within an operating system of the fiduciary duties of the corporation. And B Corps have all amended their fiduciary duties so that they are aligned with the stakeholder orientation. Right? So that all those B Corps, all those 4,000 B Corps have also aligned their governance structures. So their boards are accountable to think about the impact of the decisions on all their stakeholders, not just their shareholders. And then they have a management system to actually help them do that, right?
Yeah.
And so when I think about this question and like the next frontier is for 15 years, B Lab has been focused on this expansion of fiduciary duty for companies, company by company, all volunteer-based and all opt-in. And there's over 10,000 registered benefit corporations around the world in 6 countries and lots of moment going there. A big change for B Lab over the last year has been B Lab has recognized that has gone that adoption has been too slow, given the magnitude of the problems that we're facing socially, environmentally. And so last fall, B Lab, and it's too slow and too direct. It's both too slow and it's not enough. The too slow is wonderful. 10,000 companies. There's millions of companies in the world. So like, congratulations. What do you do? You can fit them all on a little PT boat. Doesn't really affect anything. So like, and meanwhile, climate acceleration threat. So is there, what would drive more robust adoption? And there's now increasingly bipartisan support in the US and a lot of work in the UK and other places in Latin America for actually saying, no, what we need is pre-competitive level playing field for all companies to behave this way, all companies certainly above a certain size.
Yeah.
And so what we see in the US context, we see very conservative Republicans saying that what we need is to upgrade our shareholder model to a stakeholder model. And that needs to be the case for all companies. So you get out of like the tragedy of the commons and the game theory of prisoners' dilemmas and things like that. We just need to make that a pre-competitive guardrails for the economy, is that we all need a stakeholder orientation. So one is about it being not voluntary, but being required.
Yeah.
The other thing that's been really powerful, and this is like current events with what happened with Deneau and Emmanuel Faber and other things in the last few months, is we realized that like you could have companies adopting stakeholder governance structures all you want, but if the investors are still operating on a shareholder paradigm, you've got conflict. And in that conflict, pretty much all the time, the shareholder wins.
Yeah.
And capital wins in capitalism. And so if we don't also look at the fiduciary duties for investors, at best we'll end up with the kind of tension that we had at Danone, which ended up with the ouster of one of the champions of conscious capitalism, stakeholder capitalism, and a new economic paradigm in Emmanuel Faber. And so this next frontier is going to be not only expanding fiduciary duties and the scope of play for companies, but matching that with a similar scope for investors, because we need them to be playing off of the same, singing out of the same hymnal. We need them to be playing from the same playbook. And then within that, now you have guardrails around all the economic system to say, we're stewarding our natural and social systems. We're creating value for all our stakeholders. And within that context, go compete until you're too exhausted to stay awake, right? Like knock yourself out. But you've got to do that within these pre-competitive guardrails of making sure that we're being good stewards of the systems on which we depend, whether they're natural or social. And we want to make sure that you are required to account for the impact you're having across all your stakeholders. And that's going to be what you're going to be reporting on through those standard ESG metrics that will eventually be taken into consideration, consistent with those new fiduciary duties, what your impact is on all those stakeholders, not just on those things that are financial and material to shareholders.
So, Jay, speaking about evolution, another direction that you're evolving towards now is to play on an even larger stage in your role with Imperative 21,
right?
Which for our listeners is now a coalition of 8 organizations: B Lab, the B Team, CECP, which is a collection of CEOs of pretty large companies, Common Future, Conscious Capitalism, Just Capital, Participant, and GIIN.
Right.
So talk to us about why you've taken on that role, what the broader vision is there by bringing together these fellow travelers, and what are some of the issues that they will be tackling given that combination.
Thanks, Raj. And Imperative 1 has been pretty exciting. It's sort of an organic evolution of, I think, all of those organizations, the Global Impact Investing Network, Chief Executives for Corporate Purpose, Conscious Capitalism, B Lab, the B Team, all recognizing that we're all, as you said, we're sister and brother organizations, all moving in the same direction. And we're not trying to change what anybody's doing, but we realize that there's an overarching narrative that's lacking. And that overarching narrative is that the imperative of the 21st century, that's what Imperative 21 means, the imperative of the 21st century is to drive an economic reset. So the purpose of business is to create shared well-being on a healthy planet. And that overarching narrative that all those organizations are getting behind helps create much more power, just like the B Corp model did that for individual enterprises in that sense, but it wasn't necessarily connected with conscious capitalists, or it wasn't necessarily connected with just companies, or it wasn't necessarily connected with chief executive, the CECP companies. And so is there some place that we can play together that doesn't feel branded and proprietary, but that also elevates the conversation? And this is the important thing in terms of the theory of change for this network, is individual business leadership is necessary but insufficient. Because we can't just ask business leaders to lead in a culture with contrary norms and a system with misaligned incentives. Those that are doing so are heroic, and we applaud them and we celebrate them and we honor them, and we want to spread their gospel far and wide and have other people follow their pathways. But as we said before, it's like too few and far between. And part of that is because culturally, we're in a culture of hyper individualism. We're in a culture of accumulation and more, not in a culture of interdependence and enough. And on the system side, as we said, whether it's fiduciary duty or whether it's tax regimes or other forms of compensation and performance management systems, our systems reward fairly short-term, profit-driven, enterprise-focused activity. And yet our problems require adaptive solutions, not technical solutions, require radical collaboration, not just individual heroism. And they require getting back into right relationship between the private sector, the public sector, and civil society. And that kind of social contract, we're a bit out of balance right now. And there is an important role for the private sector. Like no one's running away from that. But the question is, if we're going to address our most serious challenges, it's going to require an appropriate role for government at the national, local, multilateral level to help create those guardrails, right? And to set those pre-competitive guardrails within which we can all do our thing as we choose. But there are some challenges that are just too much for any single organization or any individual set of organizations to do. And so what Imperative 21, what all those organizations recognize together is that we want to support those business leaders to accelerate their transition to conscious capitalism, accelerate their transition to stakeholder capitalism, to build an inclusive economy. And what are the tools, resources, networks, stories that we can do to help them do that? And at the same time that we're doing that, we need to change the direction of the wind on culture. So they're not fighting a culture that's profit-driven and individualistic and I got to get mine and let everybody else figure their stuff out. And we've got to help get back into balance between the public sector and the private sector, so we have our incentive structures aligned with those very objectives. Because right now those leaders are running into really strong headwinds, both cultural and incentive headwinds, and we need to transform those. So that's the purpose of Imperative 21, is to create a more broad playing field for all of us, a broad playground for all of us to work together. And it's not just those 8 steward organizations of the network. Last summer, there were over 400 organizations around the world that were called into a co-creation process by those stewards to co-create what are now called the imperatives for economic systems change, which say, hey, that sounds great. A reset and shared well-being on a healthy planet, that all sounds wonderful. What does it actually look like? Well, what's the next layer down in practice? And so we talk about designing our institutions for interdependence, investing for justice, accounting for all stakeholders. And on the accounting for stakeholders, it's about our measurement system. It's about our incentive structures. It's about fiduciary duties. All of those things were co-created by over 400 organizations to say, we now have a common narrative and a common set of pathways that we're all going down. And I'm going to go down this pathway. Raj is going to go down that pathway because he's got a superpower that's different than my superpower. But we can now see how we relate to each other. And we're no longer competing for airspace or mental headspace. We actually see how what Raj is doing is essential and what Timothy is doing is essential, and how they all relate to the same objective, which is to have a fundamental reset of the system so that its purpose is is creating shared well-being, not just maximizing wealth.
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with wealth, but that's not the objective. The objective is well-being, and how do we make that the center of our decision making and output? And so that's what we're trying to do with Imperative 21. And like all network and coalition work, it is both. It has its extremely exciting, fun, energizing stuff, and it has its extremely frustrating, challenging moments, because we're humans, and being in relationship is hard, And so, but that's really where I'm feeling called, is to do that hard work of being in relationship with others, in a way that we really haven't been in the last 15 years. We've been more working on our own little pathways, and we need to figure out how those can join together.
Well, what I love about what you just said was that you start elevating the discussion to say this is a systems issue.
Yeah.
And, you can't, the old Einstein thing, you can't solve a problem at the same level at which it was created. And so, yes, it is about a system change. Now, as soon as you get into system change, as you said, adaptive problem solving versus technical problem solving, which is a really big difference. This is not a technical problem you're going to solve linearly. It's something we're going to have to learn into, and we're going to have to prototype and learn, and it takes a different mindset.
Yes.
So as you start getting into that system space, and elevating the game and the thinking there, what is the sort of the theory of change? What are you sort of seeing are the 2 or 3 levers? So let's take, for example, one of the 3 areas you mentioned, account for stakeholders.
Yep.
All right. Well, how do we get the system?
Right.
And the system's a global system.
Yep.
With EU regulations and London having one model, Tokyo, New York, and different models. How do we get the system thinking into something like accounting for stakeholders, and therefore here's the 3 or 4 things that we need to be exploring on the system side to make that change happen?
Yeah, that's a great question, Timothy. And my sense is that there's 3 pathways under that imperative to account for stakeholders, and when we've touched on them already. Just to one is, if you sort of the business school, aphorism that you manage what you measure.
Yeah.
And so if our measurement systems are just measuring things that are financially material, then by definition, we're going to miss on a lot of things that are material to stakeholders.
Yeah.
And so our measurement systems have to evolve, and and we've had 10 or 15 years of that evolution in sort of voluntary adoption and sort of the ferment and the creativity of 1,000 flowers blooming, and no different than we did with railways and internet protocols. And that's important for that early phase of creativity. And now we're at this next phase where there needs to be that kind of consolidation and convergence of those things into one or a few sets of standards for how we go about measuring our impact and managing our impact on all stakeholders. So I think the first major thing is on measurement management systems.
Yep.
The second thing is around incentive structures. Because you can measure and manage all this, but all we'll be measuring and managing is how little progress we've made if all the incentives are rewarding the opposite behavior, right? And so that and there are incentives everywhere, from my compensation to the performance reviews of my team, to how the capital markets work, to how tax codes are written. So there's incentives are lots of different levels of the ecosystem, but aligning our incentives with our new sense of how to manage the risks in the system and seize the opportunities for systemic change, we have to realign those incentives, and that's hard work, and that's going to involve both enterprise level incentives and sort of economy-wide or market-wide incentives. So there's a role for private enterprise, a role for public sector engagement, and them being in dialogue. And then the third one is you can have the right management systems and you can have the great incentives, but if your governance structures, what you're legally accountable to, are counter to those first 2 things, then at some point you're still going to end up with that rubber hits the road, because you're going to be at that board meeting debating whether you should do this or that. And some really smart corporate lawyer is going to say, that sounds like a great idea. The problem is you just created a whole lot of risk for yourself over here because your incentives and your operating paradigm is inconsistent with your governing paradigm. And so that's why this system of fiduciary duties and guardrails is going to be so important, because we need to align our governance structures with our management system. And so at Imperative One, we think about those three elements of accounting for stakeholders. And the only thing I'm sure about is that we're wrong, and that there are things that we're missing, and that there are things that we're overstating. But like, at least those are the three directions of travel around accounting for stakeholders, that not just those 8 organizations, but those 400 and some odd organizations that went through this co-creation process last summer and fall, that's where they ended up. And so that makes us feel like, oh, we may be incomplete.
Yeah.
And we may see things more clearly as we walk further down the path, but that's probably a good direction of travel. And to your point, there's already lots of activity moving in that direction. And so we feel like that's right. And our job is to make sure we keep our eyes focused on where we need to go, where we need to arrive at, not just what's possible as a next step. We need to operate at Horizon 1 and Horizon 2 and Horizon 3 thinking at the same time.
Yeah.
And Imperative 21's like core reason for being is to help us articulate that Horizon 3 while working with those business leaders to take those next steps, who have like very practical constraints of budgets and timeframes and tenures and all the other things that they're going to have.
Yeah.
Well, Jay, that's a beautifully articulated vision and a very clearly defined roadmap. So I'm just personally grateful to you for the role you're playing, and and the intelligence and insight and energy you're bringing to it. So thank you.
Thank you.
One of the things I think that our movements have in common is that we appeal across the spectrum. In a time when everything is divided left, right, and polarized politically, I think our conscious capitalism message, what you talk about, has the potential to appeal across the spectrum.
Yes.
Because it is rooted in voluntary exchange and freedom, and it does generate superior returns if you do it right. But it does address the very real societal concerns that so many of us have, and the craving for decency alongside the dynamism that capitalism brings us. And I think that is something we always need to remember, to make sure that we are articulating and communicating in a way that is unifying and not polarizing. Because I think when you elevate to that level of ultimately what kind of world we all want to live in, and how, I think there's so much more agreement.
Yeah, and Raj, I love what you said about we need to be able to retain the dynamism while sort of re-energizing the decency, right? Or elevating the decency piece. Mm-hmm. And if there's one other thing that I would love to just share with you in my own journey on this is, and it's a little bit about what's behind me, that the Peace and Justice poster, which came from a visit to the Equal Justice Initiative's Legacy Museum and Lynching Memorial down in Montgomery, Alabama.
Oh my God. I've heard that's incredible. Yeah.
It is. It's a pilgrimage site. At least for Americans, it's a pilgrimage. It ought to be a pilgrimage site. Mm-hmm. And where we really have to come face to face with how we got here. Mm. And it's hard. Mm-hmm. It's quite painful. There's plenty of beauty in our history and in the people who created it. And there's plenty of ugly, and while we've had a dynamic economic system, it hasn't always been a decent economic system. And in fact, its history is built on not just indecency, but injustice, and tremendous violence, and extraction of land, of labor, and that has continued to sort of morph into different forms, post emancipation, et cetera. And so one of the things that I think is going to be really important for this next phase, we talk about consciousness, right? And one of the things that's going to be very important is the first thing we have to do is to be still enough to be able to see in the still water our own truthful reflection of who we are and all of our complications, again, all of our beauty and all of our imperfections. And we have to be willing to like name it. And if we name it, we also have to recognize that there's a lot of repair work to be done at the individual level, at community levels, at institutional levels, in societies. And it's not about blame or shame. Like, people are going to feel those feelings because they're appropriate feelings to go through, but they're not great places to live, you know? And we need to move towards repair and healing and transformation towards something that we've never really had before. We've never had it before anywhere.
Yeah, we haven't.
Which is an economic system whose purpose was to create shared well-being on a healthy planet that recognized the inherent dignity of every human being, that gave them equitable investment and access to resource to realize their full potential as human beings. We've never had that, ever. And that's not about blaming anybody or feeling burdened, but I feel excited about what would it be like to be in a co-creative space with others, to envision that together and then to work towards that together. My life will be greatly improved because I'll be in right relationship with others who I'm not in right relationship with now, because we've never done the first step of just looking truthfully into the mirror and saying, I've worked my butt off. I'm a pretty smart guy, and I've been lucky, and I was born into some of my privilege is very earned, and some of it's pretty unearned, just because of where I was born in history, on the planet, in a certain family, and that doesn't diminish my smarts and my hard work. But at least for me, it does fill me with a joyful responsibility to do my bit to make things right. And that means that this other frontier about systems change also requires a real cultural and change internally in us as individuals. And that's hard for all of us who are like, we're super type A. We like to do things fast and scale and systems this and you know, and a lot of this is really personal work. And so the last thing I would sort of leave is, I have found it really, really powerful to combine this sort of systems change work with this sort of personal change work, and to be able to look at the I, the we, the it levers and make sure and know that they all interplay with each other. And that this first piece of it is this sort of truth telling and repair work that acknowledges how we got here and says, yeah, I don't want to do that again. I don't want to perpetuate that even by accident, even without intention. You know, I don't want to perpetuate that, which means that folks like me are going to have to learn how to be pretty good listeners, because there are lots of things I don't hear the first time, or I don't see particularly well. And while that's sometimes been really uncomfortable and even painful at times, the end of it has always been, I've been a better person, and I've also been a better leader and a better partner for having gone through that journey. And so as you're you know, doing all your amazing work with the Conscious Capitalism podcast, I think this is this other lens on the consciousness piece that's going to be really important for this next phase of our journey together.
So beautifully articulated, Jay. I'm very moved. You know, I think in Conscious Capitalism, we haven't focused enough at that it level, and that's the opportunity we have now being part of Imperative. And if I think about what we have accomplished in this society, despite our wounds, in a sense, with one arm tied behind our back, just imagine what we could do when we are fully healed. You know, we've never gone through the truth and reconciliation type of process that they had in South Africa. And you know, one of the visions I had when I went to the Ecuador rainforest and I had an ayahuasca journey there with a shaman, the vision, and I had gone there to learn about healing. And the vision was, what we need to heal are these four things: love, innocence, simplicity, and truth. If I think about what you just talked about, it embodies all of that, right? We need to listen, and from that place of listening, get to a place of genuine love and not intimidation and fear and using and
Yes.
abusing. We have become corrupted. We need to actually reclaim a kind of American innocence, right? Because there are too many things that have happened that we haven't
Yeah.
come to terms with.
Yeah.
The natives, the slaves, I mean, those are the two big ones, but there's more, right?
Yes, of
We need to
course.
get back to that strong innocence, that chosen innocence, right? We need to focus on the real essentials, which are simple.
Right.
And we need this deep commitment to the truth.
Yes.
And I think that is what will see us through into the future.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful, Raj. I agree. And I'm sitting with this notion of innocence, and in my mind, like, of course I didn't think of guilt, right? I think of, just because they sort of show up in at least my mind as like these things. And I'm wondering, I'm left wondering if we can sit in the truth that we're all more complicated than either being innocent or guilty.
Mm.
And I know you weren't suggesting that. I'm just saying, like, that's what's like in thinking about those things that's coming up for me.
Sure.
Is because I think that often, particularly on these issues, people get stuck.
Mm.
Particularly white people get stuck feeling attacked.
Mhm.
And then the natural resistance when you're getting attacked is to, like, you pull back and be defensive, or put up your armor, or be defensive. And so I'm struggling for language, and I'm struggling for ways to be in right relationship that can recognize my lack of innocence, meaning naivete in that sense, but also not having to feel like I'm then all of a sudden guilty. And then to, like sort of sitting in a place of responsibility and accountability, but not paralyzed, where all of a sudden I feel othered and unseen and unvalued.
Yeah.
And I think that's going to be really hard. I think it's going to be the journey of a lifetime, for me individually and for all of us to find that space. So I appreciate you've done a lot more work on this, Raj, than I have. And so I'd be excited to explore some of that stuff with you some other time more deeply. But I really appreciate you going there. It's really lovely.
So I think we've got a good place here of wrapping this up. And I think that there's two big takeaways for our listeners. One is, be the change you want to see in the world. So there's a whole journey of consciousness and our own awakening, our own paths that we need to go on. And there's also this opportunity to participate in things like the B Labs and BCorps and Conscious Capitalism and Imperative 21, where we are collectively trying to make a change to the it. So that's a call to all of you to ask yourselves, what are you doing on those two dimensions? And thank you, listeners. Thank you, Jay, for being with us this week for a wide-ranging and very insightful set of thoughts and comments. And thank you to our listeners for listening. And if you enjoyed the podcast on whatever channel that you're listening on, please, there is a little subscription button. Hit that subscription button. And if you enjoyed what you heard, please go over to Spotify or to Apple podcast and click in your comments and your rating for us. And if you have any thoughts for Raj and I, please go to theconsciouscapitalists.com, where there is a place on that website where you can leave Raj and I a note. Jay, thank you so much for your time. And thanks to Carla Villegas, our producer, who produces this each week. And thank you to our listeners.
Thank you, Timothy. Thanks, Raj.